Ever since I first saw it as a teenager, the film Catch-22 became, and after repeated viewings over the years, has remained one of my all-time favorite movies. Based on the classic novel by Joseph Heller, directed by Mike Nichols, a screenplay by Buck Henry, and an unbelievable ensemble of actors, most of whom were just at the beginning of their careers, this movie blew my mind with its absurdist humor, time-weaving narrative structure, and truly astonishing cinematography. Watching it again after many years, I have to admit that not all of it holds up to our modern sensibilities, but it really is an astonishing piece of filmmaking that doesn't get enough credit. There is so much I like about this movie, but for this, my first video essay ever, I'd like to focus on just one scene. But before we get to that, a bit of context. The protagonist is Yossarian, played by the amazing Alan Arkin, a bombardier in a B-25 squadron during World War II. At the beginning of the film, he finds out that the required number of missions that are needed to fly before being sent home has just been raised. He visits the squadron doctor asking to be grounded based on his fragile mental state and is told that he can be, except for one thing.
There's a catch. A catch? Sure, catch-22. Anyone who wants to get out of combat isn't really crazy, so I can't ground him.
In other words,
in order to be grounded, I've got to be crazy. And I must be crazy to keep flying. But if I ask to be grounded, that means I'm not crazy anymore and I have to keep flying. You've got it. That's catch-22.
Okay, so we're coming up on the scene I want to focus on. Now, I have always been a fan of long takes or one-shots in movies. To me, it represents every single person involved having to do every single thing perfectly, or else the take doesn't work and they have to do it again. In this scene, the corrupt Colonel Cathcart, played by Martin Balsam, is met by the scheming mess officer Milo Minderbinder, played by a young pre-midnight cowboy John Voight, regarding a war profiteering scheme they've recently hatched. Now, for the sake of this video essay, it really doesn't matter what they're saying. I just want you to focus on the 60-second, one-take shot that begins right here.
Of the countries that we're dealing with.
What countries are you dealing with?
The African nations, sir.
African?
Well, the countries in the greater Mediterranean area, sir.
Oh, I see.
So, what we have to have is an additional assignment of personnel, a little time, and the plan. I have at my disposal. I can get the gas.
Well, all right.
And if I was taken off combat duty, sir, that is just until I get this thing into operation.
But Milo...
I know, sir, that I'm just an acting mess officer, Colonel, but it's a job that requires my full attention, I believe. It's to everyone's benefit.
Well, all right. Take whatever you need, Milo.
Thank you, sir. You see, what I hope to do is to give the men in this squadron the finest cuisine in the entire world. That's really something to shoot at, isn't it?
Yes, Milo, it certainly is.
Okay, there is so much to unpack here. But let's begin with the basics. What we have here is clearly a tracking shot, camera on a dolly, with the two actors engaged in a conversation. In the background, a real B-25 bomber, billowing smoke, is looking like it is about to crash. Now, since the plane is behind the two actors, we, the audience, see what's happening before they do, and we're waiting for them to notice and take cover. But they don't notice. And it's only when the plane's tires graze the runway, making a loud screeching sound, that we realize it's not that they haven't noticed what's happening, it's that they simply don't care, almost as if it's a routine occurrence. At this point, the plane hurtles past the characters and out of camera range, and we hear a huge explosion. The actors, still engrossed in their conversation, walk past the camera, which has reached the end of its dolly tracks and swivels around, now following them and revealing a B-25 in flames a few hundred feet beyond a Jeep at the side of the runway. Never once do either of them look at the wreckage, though Minderbinder makes sure to wipe off any ashes on Cathcart's seat as they get in the Jeep, all the while continuing their conversation about how to provide better cuisine for the officers. As they drive away, we hear another explosion that blows both their caps off their heads, but they are undaunted, simply reaching back and putting them back on as if nothing happened at all. Now let's break down the logistical and technical aspects of the scene, starting with location. The story is set off the coast of Italy in 1942, but the movie was filmed in 1969 on location in Mexico, where they built a 6,000-foot airfield specifically for the shoot. They brought in 18 flyable B-25s and one unflyable Hulk that was used for the crashed plane. For this scene to work, the actors and crew needed to be in place and ready to go until the working B-25, rigged with smoke bombs pouring out of the left engine and flown by renowned Hollywood stunt pilot Frank Talman, was in sight. It took several takes to get everything just right, and here's the audio commentary track of Mike Nichols telling Steven Soderbergh about the one that made it into the movie.
Now, how many takes on this one?
Well, many takes on this one, and what happens at the end of this,
I'm assuming you have another plane already burning.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But the fact it is not already burning, this was a surprise that the crew rigged for me. They actually blew this plane up, but they did it just before we got there.
Really?
Yeah, they did it as a surprise for me. They were so happy to surprise me, but they didn't check on where the camera would be when. So we missed.
It was too early?
It was too early.
In other words, after several takes where we simply see a burning plane just beyond the Jeep, the crew secretly rigged the stationary plane with explosives and detonated it during the scene in order to capture a real explosion in the shot. But because the camera hadn't swiveled in that direction yet, the explosion wasn't caught on film. But if you look closely, you can see the very tail end of the fireball it formed. And unfortunately, they weren't able to do another take. Here's why.
We had signed something with the Mexican government promising that we would take out all the planes we brought in because we had the 6th largest air force in the world. And they were worried that we would take out fewer planes than we left there. So we couldn't keep blowing up planes.
Right.
Now let's watch the scene again, focusing solely on the actors this time, because there is actually some very important plot and character development happening here. In the scene, we learn that Milo is trying to convince Cathcart to let him sell off important U.S. Army equipment to other countries in exchange for better cuisine for the men.
It would be a fair trade, sir.
Both Voight and Balsam were directed to stay completely focused on their dialogue and absolutely ignore everything happening around them. And every time I watch it, I am blown away by how relaxed, playful, and oblivious they are. I mean, just look how close the plane is to them right now. And if what Nichols said about the surprise explosion is true, then we can only assume that while the camera didn't catch it, the actors certainly saw and felt the explosion that was detonated right in front of them, all the while continuing their dialogue, paying no heed whatsoever to the carnage in front of them. If Oscars were handed out for commitment and concentration, I nominate these guys. Oh, before I forget, quick side note. If you take a look at the trail of smoke behind the plane here, you can clearly see that it extends far beyond the wrecked plane on the runway, but because the plane was perfectly placed by the crew, it obscures our vision of the other plane landing safely several hundred yards down the runway. Now, for most filmmakers, that would be more than enough, especially in a brief, almost throwaway scene like this, but not for Nichols, who decided to add one final gag to put a button on it. As the Jeep starts to drive away from the wreckage and the camera swivels with it, we hear but don't see another explosion behind them that blows both their caps off their heads. And again, because this scene was shot in one take with no special effects and decades before CGI was invented, they had to have some kind of powerful wind machine set up in exactly the right place to represent the blast. And here's something I only just discovered during the making of this video. When the blast blows off their caps, you can see that Cathcart's is projected forward in front of the Jeep, and Minderbinder's is projected backward, landing in the back seat. I can only imagine this was discovered during rehearsals and that it was decided to have two replacement caps placed within reach so that it appears they simply grabbed their original caps and put them back on as they drove away, further signifying their own vanity and lack of empathy for the victims of the crash. All this for a 60-second scene about plot development. I know I'm on the verge of beating a dead horse here, but honestly, I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of what went into the making of this scene, as I haven't even touched on the incredible sound design, the golden hour lighting, and the stunning photography. So bearing all this in mind, as well as everything we've broken down so far, let's watch and enjoy this short, epic scene one more time in its entirety.
Colonel Korn, I'd like you to stay in the control tower.
Sir?
Stay on top of this mission. It's a tough one. I'd like to know when my boys make target.
Yes, sir.
What is it, Lieutenant Binder?
An egg, sir.
I know that, Lieutenant.
A fresh egg, sir.
Where did you get the egg?
In Malta, sir. Where there are enough chickens to lay fresh eggs for every officer in the squadron. At 5 cents apiece from the mess fund.
Yes?
With a clear profit of 2 cents per egg.
For whom?
Sir, for whomever sells the eggs to the mess.
And who may that be, Milo?
Ah, sir, oranges from Marrakesh and pecans.
Pecan.
And in Palermo, sir, 10,000 gallons of the finest Italian olive oil. The Sicilians need blankets. It would be a fair trade, sir. There's an interested party in Sardinia. All we need is the cooperation of the countries that we're dealing with.
What countries are you dealing with?
The African nations, sir.
African?
Well, the countries in the greater Mediterranean area, sir.
Oh, I see.
So, what we have to have is an additional assignment of personnel, a little time, and the plan. I have at my disposal. I can get the gas.
Well, all right.
And if I was taken off combat duty, sir, that is just until I get this thing into operation.
But Milo,
I know, sir, that I'm just an acting mess officer, Colonel, but it's a job that requires my full attention, I believe. It's for everyone's benefit.
Well, all right. Take whatever you need, Milo.
Thank you, sir. You see, what I hope to do is to give the men in this squadron the finest cuisine in the entire world. That's really something to shoot at, isn't it?
Yes, Milo, it certainly is.
Catch-22 was released in 1970 and was by all accounts a critical and commercial flop, mainly because another satirical anti-war film called MASH had been released 2 months earlier to great acclaim. But as we all know, time is the great equalizer, and I have to say that MASH, with its blatant misogyny,
Well, hi, hot lips.
embarrassing homophobia,
decided that I'm going to commit suicide.
and a ridiculous slapstick football game that takes up almost the entire last third of the movie, has not held up well at all.
My God, they shot him!
And while Catch-22, like most 70s movies of the time, has a couple of its own cringy, misogynistic moments, one specifically that is just flat out embarrassing to watch, overall the movie has something bigger on its mind and a real and sincere pathos for soldiers mired in the morass of an absurdist bureaucracy.
Who is this man?
Major Danby, sir.
Danby, D-A-N-B-Y. Take him out and shoot him.
Sir? I said take him out and shoot him. Can't you hear?
Yes, sir. Take Major Danby out and shoot him.
I think you better wait a minute, Dad.
What?
I don't think you can shoot him.
Why the hell can't I? Why not? You mean I can't shoot whoever I want to? Is that a fact?
Despite a few obvious shortcomings, I think this movie just gets better with age, and to my mind is second only to Dr. Strangelove as our greatest, sharpest, and funniest of anti-war satires.
Something wrong?
No. I just thought I saw something.
Naked man in a tree?
Yes, that's it.
That's just your Sarian.
Oh.
I think it's high time this overlooked classic gets the credit it deserves, because as Steven Soderbergh says,
I mean, I have to say, I think it's literally one of the best photograph films I've ever seen. And for the locale and the period, I'd hate to see it shot differently, I have to say.
and as Mike Nichols, in a classic example of understatement, replies,
I think it was right.
Thanks so much for watching. As I said, this is my first and possibly last video essay ever, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. So if you have a comment, please leave it below.